To the special recorded talk with Robert Bailey, which was previously cancelled due to heavy snow in Colorado. Before I introduce Dr. Bailey, we would like to acknowledge that CU Boulder sits on the territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Eastern Shoshone peoples, and 48 tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. It is critical not only to acknowledge, but also to actively address the particular harms that settler colonialism and institutions who benefit from colonialism, including CU Boulder, perpetuate on Indigenous lands and peoples, especially in the context of this Mellon Sawyer seminar, where we are seeking to attend to more capacious humanities, arts, and sciences-based alliances for long-term ecological transformation. Simultaneously, we assert that such alliances must also acknowledge the socio-cultural, artistic, linguistic, and other strategies that Indigenous communities have used and continue to use to respond to intensive ecological disruptions. We also want to thank our collaborative partners today. This program is generously funded by a Sawyer Seminar on the Comparative Study of Cultures grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Additionally, we thank our institutional partners at CU Boulder, the Nest Studio for the Arts, the Natural Hazards Center, the Center for Native American and Indigenous Studies, and the Art and Art History Department. This public lecture is one of multiple, along with several art exhibitions around the Boulder, Denver area that will be hosted this semester as part of the 2020 and 2021 Mellon Sawyer Seminar, Deep Horizons, Making Visible an Unseen Spectrum of Ecological Casualties and Prospects. We aim to traverse multiple disciplines and perspectives to investigate intersectional questions concerning the changing planet as it affects specific peoples, communities, wildlife species, and ecosystems in varying and inequitable ways. This project calls for empathy, attunement, and an outlook that encompasses a diversity of individuals, communities, and collaborative entities committed to climate justice and more ethically durable futures. Please do visit our Environmental Futures website to learn more and to register for upcoming events. I would now like to introduce today's speaker, Robert Bailey. Dr. Robert Bailey is an Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Oklahoma with affiliate faculty status in Film and Media Studies. He received his PhD in the History of Art and Architecture from the University of Pittsburgh, where he also studied philosophy. Dr. Bailey researches and teaches the history of modern and contemporary art, as well as the historiography and methodology of art history. His work explores how artists and art historians configure relations of theory and practice amidst ongoing historical transformations, including globalization, the digital revolution, and the Anthropocene. Dr. Bailey's work on conceptual art and conceptualism has resulted in publications in exhibit catalogues, journals, and 2 books that situate their intellectual character within changing geopolitical contexts, a monograph titled Art and Language International, Conceptual Art Between Art Worlds, published by Duke in 2016, and a volume of Terry Smith's writing that he edited and introduced entitled 1 and 5 Ideas on Conceptual Art and Conceptualism, also published by Duke. Currently, Dr. Bailey is completing 2 books. One considers how artists address the shifting status of labor in the post-Fordist economy, and the other draws on extensive field research in arid regions of the Western United States to propose methods for giving art historical accounts of the effects that human artfulness has on nature. And with that said, I will hand it over to Dr. Bailey. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Bonnie, for that kind introduction. And I also like to thank Brianne Cohen and Aaron Espily for inviting me to participate in this seminar. It's an honor to be speaking with you today and through this recording with whomever encounters it down the line. The hope had been that this talk might have happened in person once upon a time. That is obviously not possible because of the pandemic. And then the hope had been that we would be able to Zoom into a public lecture setting with a class attached, and a snowstorm swept away that possibility as well. So we're now we're doing this this talk via this recording here, and hopefully it finds its way into the world in some fashion and connects with whomever is meant to receive it. I also wanted to add by way of beginning that I'm honored to be speaking on the homelands of the Eastern Shoshone, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and the Ute peoples. And I'm also honored to be speaking from the homelands of the Caddo and Wichita peoples in Oklahoma. Here in Oklahoma, there are 39 federally recognized tribes who have a homeland relationship with the state. And that's the result of a lot of genocidal policies of the US federal government, of forced removal, and of dispossession of Native peoples who were forced to migrate here. And so I want to recognize that history and also advocate for taking steps toward repatriating land to Native communities when and where possible. The talk today will focus on some of the more environmental and ecological aspects of some of my recent work, and it'll feel more like an artist talk maybe than an art historian's lecture. And I guess with that, I'll jump into a PowerPoint that I've got here, and we'll get started. So. The title that I've chosen is just a very kind of blanket idea, the notion of a field report, because I'll be kind of reporting back to you, the audience, on the from some of the research that I've been doing in the last few years. And I've got one kind of introductory slide here that will set things up a little bit, and then everything else will be images to look at and things to be thinking about. What I'm going to talk to you about today is kind of a notion I've been developing loosely under a heading something like outside art history. I've been interested in the idea that that art history, a discipline that usually is fairly confined to indoor spaces, might get out into the broader environment and start to address its characteristic methodologies and approaches to making knowledge in some unusual places, at least unusual for art historians. So broadly speaking, I've been pursuing an art history that's more capable of participating in our culture and our society's broader discussions about humanity, the environment, and our inherently artful agency. And that's meant a few different things. First of all, it's meant going back into a lot of the kind of key foundational texts that art historians rely upon in order to do what they do, and looking for ways that our discipline can be of greater use in terms of addressing all that recent environmental history has brought to light. I teach a graduate methodology seminar here at OU. And so I'm constantly kind of revisiting the history of the discipline and thinking about how we got to where we are. And so going back into that mess of text and looking for cues for how certain analytical or descriptive tools can be made useful for addressing things that aren't conventionally understood as works of art, but nevertheless, art history might be of value there. So a kind of analogy or metaphor might be like, a mechanic who operates on cars has a certain set of tools, but they could be used to do other things. And I've been interested in how the tools that an art historian possesses could be used to do things other than describe and explain works of visual art and then write histories about them. Like, what else could we do with that toolkit? And specifically, how could we address it to environmental and ecological concerns? I won't belabor that first point with too much nitty gritty. Instead, I'll get into some of the other things that are maybe more exciting, and I've been writing some about that first point, and eventually that will find its way out into the world. So if you're interested, keep an ear to the ground, I guess. But the second point is that I've been developing fieldwork methods for doing art history that involve leaving behind the indoor spaces like museums and galleries, libraries and archives for outdoor spaces. So shifting some of the research methodologies for art history away from maybe more conventional kind of humanistic archival sorts of approaches, and treating maybe the landscape as a kind of archive, or treating the field as a place where knowledge can be produced. So leaving behind the indoor spaces that we usually do art history within, and seeing what other horizons there might be. So I'll be talking a bit about kind of process and method a bit. And then lastly, I've been exploring possibilities for interdisciplinary collaboration and public presentation of art historical work. It often feels like when you're writing scholarly things that they wind up, almost dead on arrival in some journal or some academic setting where your audience is limited to the same 7 people over and over again, or something like that. And so I've been really interested in how both within and beyond the academy, we can work to open up new avenues for inquiry and new ways of connecting to possible publics whose input can then kind of feed back into knowledge producing procedures. So a lot of the work that you'll see today isn't your usual kind of scholarly production. Instead, it's something that's intended for either a broader audience or is operating kind of in an interdisciplinary space between different kinds of producers or thinkers. And to that end, my major collaborators in the process of doing all of this work, who I would like to thank here and also just acknowledge in terms of their role in the process. First of all, a project called Fieldworks, which is a mobile residency program. That's a bit of a contradiction. Residencies are usually in residence, not mobile, but nevertheless, a mobile residency program that my colleague Todd Stewart and I have been pursuing for the last half decade or so. We organize field trips, sometimes with students, sometimes with other collaborators, and visit some of the regions where we do a lot of our research. And so that's been a kind of an incubator for a lot of this thinking. And Todd has been a regular collaborator on a lot of the projects that you'll see. You'll see a lot. He's a photographer. You'll see a lot of his photographs in the slides I have to show. And then secondly, a research group here at the University of Oklahoma called Inhabiting the Anthropocene, which publishes a blog as well as hosting regular meetings to discuss our research or our colleagues' research. And so that's been another kind of incubating space for a lot of these ideas. You won't see it surface as much in the talk today, but it's kind of humming along as a constant presence in terms of what I'm thinking about and how I'm thinking. So acknowledging that group of colleagues as well. And please do check out the blog. You can just Google Inhabiting the Anthropocene and it will show up. And I've done a handful of posts, and a number of other faculty here at OU who work on environmental topics of one kind or another have as well, and then guest posts, etc. So it's been a good group to be working with, and you'll see at least one or two projects later on in the talk are things that directly come out of that blog space. So that's kind of by way of setting things up a little bit. And then what I want to do is first speak just briefly about some process in terms of what field work might be like for an art historian. I by no means have exhausted the possibilities, and others have done versions of this as well. But here's one version of our group out in southern Nevada, not too far from Las Vegas. And that's me with much shorter pre-pandemic hair, also before it all went gray, in the plaid, and then my collaborator Todd Stewart over here in the dark shirt. And another person who I'll highlight is Brent Goddard, who's a musician and sound artist and does quite a bit of sonic collaboration with us in our exhibition projects as well. Everyone else here is a student at the University of Oklahoma on this particular excursion, though we've brought groups from other universities out as well. That'll come up later on in the talk. So we're out there doing our thing, and this is just us posing to say hi, I suppose. This is maybe more the kind of action shots showing what it is that we're up to. On the left-hand side, I'm leading a group of students up Wheeler Peak in Nevada. There's also a Wheeler Peak in New Mexico, which is a whole separate mountain. The one in Nevada has a tree stump on it that belongs to a tree cut down in the 1960s, which, as it happened, turned out to have been the oldest living thing on the planet, at least according to certain ways of understanding what the oldest living thing on the planet would be. And so we were in search of that particular tree stump on this occasion, but the snow actually got impenetrable at a certain elevation, and we didn't make it on that particular trip. So I'm here explaining to the students that history a little bit. The tree has many different names and designations depending on who you're asking, but one of its names is Prometheus. So if you're interested in looking it up more, that would be the way to do so. So I'm telling the Prometheus myth here and talking a bit about how knowledge production often leads to sort of stray results. So Prometheus, the Greek myth, ties into all of our arts as a human species are given to us the gift of fire that allows us to be sort of technological beings that manipulate the environment. And so there's a kind of irony that this tree had borne that name and then gets cut down through the kind of artful practices of scientists doing their research in the field. So we're thinking about knowledge production and its ecological consequences there. On the right-hand side, I'm, I guess, on my own in a spot called Bombay Beach, which is in Southern California near the Salton Sea. These are two locations that I'll return to later in the talk to show some of the work that came from this research. And I'm doing what I'm always doing in the field, which is making tons and tons of notes. And so my next slide shows you what that looks like. On the left-hand side is I think some notes from Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty in the Great Salt Lake. I'm guessing because there's a big spiral on the page that I've drawn. And then on the right-hand side are a whole ton of my notebooks open to various kinds of sketches or jottings of one sort or another. I do drawings, but mostly writing. I'm a humanist after all. And I'm sometimes just writing down facts or basic observations, other times more thoroughly worked up descriptions of things, sometimes more kind of literary or poetic types of writing. And all of that then feeds into exhibition projects and other publications and other kinds of projects, which I'll now start to show you. So this is, in a sense, my field work is generating this collection of notebooks that I can then draw on as a kind of personal archive in order to generate other kinds of output. So the first exhibition that came out of the Fieldworks project was called Erratic Fieldwork, and it was hosted locally here in Norman by the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art, which is our campus museum, and it's a great museum, so a small shout out to them, and check them out if you're not familiar with them. The gallery that we were given for this exhibition is a long and narrow space, and so what we thought to do was to fill it with a kind of horizontal presentation of objects on a series of tables, and then to use the long running wall to generate an enormous text piece that would help to articulate what was going on those tabletops. So there's a relationship of each table to a corresponding wall text. So here, this installation shot is giving you a view of the bulk of the exhibition, kind of running along its course there with an introductory text on the far wall, but then along the right-hand side, texts that correspond to the larger installation. And so I'll show you some more detailed shots to give you a sense of how this operates. So what you see in front of you on the tabletop is a mixture of a whole wide range of things, a kind of organized chaos within the confines of a rectangle. And it includes everything from photographs that Todd has made in the field or that our students have made in the field, to my notes and notebooks, to research materials like books by other scholars who we've read and have been influenced by or about some of the places that we've visited. Film and video work, again, Brent Goddard has done a lot of that for us, so that you see a projection of a video on this tabletop. And then objects from an archive that we populate as we travel with things that we find on the road. People leave all kinds of strange objects abandoned in the desert, which includes everything from, on this particular table, like a spooled bit of magnetic tape, to an adding machine, to a small clumping of weird plastic fragments. We're not quite sure what those were. They looked like tiles or something like that, to an iconic and kind of cliched image of the West, a tumbleweed, which incidentally is actually not indigenous to the United States, though it's got kind of iconic status here. It first arrived in the US, I believe, in South Dakota in a grain shipment from Russia, and it then migrated its way across the landscape. So it's one of these things that's iconically identified with some of the places that we visit, but it actually has a history that's involved in kind of global trade relations, and it sort of is a plant-based colonizer in its way, which is quite fascinating to then put into the larger matrix of all the things that we're thinking about and looking at. So the idea is you would come and look at a tabletop like this, and it would be initially just a large mess of things, and you gradually start examining and interpreting what you see before you. And you've got this text on the wall, which in this image is maybe not legible. I'll show you another image in which things are a bit clearer, but nevertheless, you're making meaning between images, objects, texts, and sounds. There's actually a headset that you don't see that comes out of that video projector to listen to the video file that's being presented. So you're put in the position of a field worker, in a sense, by this exhibition. You're doing in the museum some of the same things that we're doing when we're out doing research, and you're making meaning out of the kind of jumbled, messed up arena that you find yourself in, trying to decide what matters and how, and what has meaning in what particular kind of sense. And you've got whatever sort of limited guides you have to that space, a book here or a wall text or something like that, to give you bits of information. So to me, as an art historian, what's funny is that this thing maybe looks like an art installation to most people. I think of it as a kind of playground for thinking art historically. This is a whole bunch of stuff that you can use methods for describing and evaluating and analyzing and narrating in terms of the materiality and the form and the meaning of those objects, in order to tell yourself something about the deserts of the Western United States. And so to me, this is an art historical project through and through. I think to Todd, it's a photographic project through and through. To other students, it's something else altogether. And to most audiences, it's an art show in a museum. But it has all those different kinds of levels and layers or valences to it, which is what makes it, I think, interesting to all of us to participate in as a larger kind of shared enterprise. So that's that particular tabletop. Here's another one kind of focused more on an array of things. And in this case, just to kind of take you on a little limited tour of things, the big photograph kind of on the lower left-hand side there is of a site called Giant Rock, which is in the Mojave Desert, not too terribly far from like Joshua Tree National Park. And it's depending on how you account for things, maybe one of the larger freestanding boulders in the world. In that image, I don't know if it's how visible it is. There's four like small boys climbing on a little fragment of the rock that broke off, and they're each 4 feet tall or something. The rock is about 50 feet tall. It's really quite an imposing presence, and it has this really rich history as a gathering point going way back into prehistory, on up to a number of people in the 20th century who used it as a dwelling. There's actually since filled in with cement, but a carved out dwelling underneath the rock. And then kind of an eccentric UFO enthusiast believed he could contact aliens from this rock and built a kind of antenna on top of it. So it's this site that has brought people for many different reasons over many different centuries. And so we're part of that larger kind of history of visitation to the place. And in thinking about that particular site, we surrounded it with other material that relates to it, including on the left-hand side, there's a student notebook with drawings of Giant Rock that's held open by a rock. One of my notebooks to the right with my reflections on that site. There's a piece of basalt on the table that actually comes from very far away. It comes from Utah, whereas Giant Rock is made of granite. So there's this kind of network of associations that builds up between the objects on the table. And immediately adjacent to the Giant Rock photograph, but flipped upside down for viewers on the other side of the table, is a shot of another colleague of ours during another kind of fieldwork trip that came out of the University of Oklahoma in the past, standing on a pile of rocks in the Mojave Desert. So you can build up these kind of relationships around land, around place, around site. And then other items start to gesture in other directions. For instance, that gilt red leather volume there is one of the US Geological Survey reports from the 19th century, when the government sent people to survey the land in the West to determine things like what resources could be extracted or who was living there and how they might be removed from that land, and so forth and so on. So, so the notion of land and place starts to accrue different valences as you think it in relationship to then, like, say, a colonial history, or there's that map on the table thinking about representational practices and how they relate to the realities of land, and so forth and so on. So our hope is that someone who stands and looks at this long enough starts to draw those kinds of connections out of the material. And there's a system in place also to help them. You've probably noticed these little colored tokens that are next to each item that's presented. And those allude to a wall text in this case. This was sort of a metadata set that I developed around each object in the show and then shrunk to a size that would fit into the gallery for this exhibition. And you can see certain well, every item is numbered with a basic description and then is assigned different qualities or concepts or colors or moods that relate to it. And you're free to, in a sense, add your own thoughts about the object or to trace certain concepts through the exhibition. So you'll notice, like, the concept of journey is tagged with a blue diamond here. Anything in the exhibition that has a blue token next to it relates to that theme in some way. And so you can build associations between the objects on the table, or you can track across all the different tables a common thread by following a certain color. And you can, of course, invent your own. There could be, there's, for instance, the quality of crypticness is here on the list, but it's not given a color. But you could take that if you want and say, what's cryptic about this exhibition? What does what does concealment or obscurity mean in this particular context? And so the hope is that people are, in effect, mapping their intellectual frameworks and concepts and language onto the materiality on the table, which, again, for me is thoroughly kind of an art historical process. So that's an example of that exhibition, which is emblematic of a lot of the exhibitions we do for Fieldworks. And just to show you, here's some of my hastily scribbled and then re-scribbled notes from some of our work to just show you that that's in the mix. And I guess if you can decode all of this, you'd understand everything that's going on, but even I can't make sense of all of these scratches that I've made. So that's there. Um, but another exhibition of ours that was more focused, that first show at the Fred Jones Jr. was a kind of a big survey of a long trip that we'd taken and other material that we'd gathered, kind of showing an overview of the entirety of the 4 deserts that make up the southwestern US desert ecosystem. And for this particular exhibition, we wanted to take a more focused approach, and we were interested in the obsession that people seem to have with origins and firstness. And so we looked at 3 examples of first things in the southwestern region of the US, and organized an exhibition around those sites. So that subtitle, Points, Roots, Impacts, I'll explain to you in a moment, refers to 3 different kind of origins that you can tell, origin stories that you can tell based on locations in the Southwest US. And this show happened at a small gallery in Albuquerque called Vitrine that sadly is no more, but it was a fantastic space. I don't know if they have an archival record of it or not, but definitely worth checking out if there is something. So this is almost the entire exhibition. There's another wall that you're not seeing that has more material, but this will give you enough to understand what was going on. We were interested, as I said, in this kind of cultural obsession with oldness and origins and measurement and all of these kinds of related themes. And so we gathered together objects and artifacts from our archive and scholarship and other kinds of material, as well as photographs and writings, all pertaining to 3 places. The first is a place near Albuquerque, so it was fitting that we were exhibiting there, called Sandia Cave, which is a cave that archaeologists have done considerable excavations in. One of them, a guy named Frank Hibben, who taught at the University of New Mexico for a long time and is closely associated to the university there, may or may not, but probably may, have salted the cave, which means that he introduced fraudulent artifacts into the archaeological site and then claimed to have found them there. And so there are spear points that were found there that don't quite resemble the ones that ought to have been there. And he used those in order to argue that there had been human presence in the Americas for longer than archaeologists had previously believed, by a tune of like several tens of thousands of years. And so this introduced into his own published writings. He was an author with a track record in academia, published in scholarly journals and published books for academic and popular consumption, an error, in effect, of his own devising. And so we were interested in this kind of false origin of like, when did people arrive in the Americas? And, if you ask indigenous people, they have their stories. If you ask scientists, they have their stories. And so we were interested in this as a kind of contested origin point. And so we included a number of Hibben's books in the exhibition, his articles, and then other information about the kind of revelation that maybe his stories weren't all that they were cracked up to be, and the kind of debunking of his research. So that was one kind of origin point to do with human presence on the land. We also referred again to the tree Prometheus as the oldest living thing in the world, thinking about origins of life or oldest living things, and how far back there are trees on that same mountain that are older than human civilization in terms of like sedentary human civilization, and that's really amazing. They've just been sitting there for 4,000 or 5,000 years being trees. And so thinking about the kind of records that those leave or capture about us, you can measure, in fact, climate change in the tree rings of those trees in the way that they grow over time. And so thinking about origins of life and the narrative of the cutting down of that particular tree. And so the 2 photographs that you're seeing large on the wall there, left-hand side is a photograph from inside Sandia Cave of the light coming in. On the right-hand side is a photograph of a bristlecone pine tree like Prometheus from Wheeler Peak. And then the third site is a place called Meteor Crater, which is in Arizona. If you're driving west on Interstate 40 from Albuquerque, there'll be road signs. You can pull off and spend far too much money on a roadside attraction to go see a really impressive meteor crater. And the meteorites that are the result of that impact were used by a scientist named Claire Cameron Patterson to date the age of the Earth. And so the origins of the planet, or our ability to know that the Earth is 4.5-ish billion years old, comes from these particular meteorites. And we had a sample of them on the table there. So the exhibition was in this very small gallery. And the nice thing about it was that because it was small and it was up for a short period of time, and the gallery had kind of open by appointment hours, it made for a very interactive show where people could come and like read things and look through books and make their own meaning out of the arrangement of things. But in general, we're kind of pointing them toward these questions of like why it is that we're so concerned about where things come from or how they get to us from the points in time that they do. And so we also produced a small kind of dossier in collaboration with an alumna of our road trip program named Katrina Ward, who runs a graphic design business in Oklahoma City. And so she helped us pull together a poster. This is the front and back of that with a number of Todd's images from the exhibition and captions that I wrote about all the different kinds of human activities that go on at these particular sites. And then some short kind of micro essays that I wrote on index cards, and that all came together as a package of material that people could bring with them from the exhibition, so they could continue thinking about that particular experience and what they'd seen and thought about in the gallery. A third exhibition that I want to look at is one that speaks really to the kind of collaborative nature of the Fieldworks project. It's called Compendium, and it happened at the Southern Utah Museum of Art in Cedar City just a couple of years ago. We collaborated with Southern Utah University through a colleague of ours there named Jessica Farling, who runs the campus museum, and brought a group of our students to meet with a group of their students and organize one of our road trips together collaboratively. And we visited the Great Basin region of the United States, which for those who don't know is sort of Nevada and Utah for the most part. And it's an interior area where water doesn't escape to, either to the ocean or to the Gulf of Mexico. So it's this kind of endorheic region would be the scientific term for it, where all the rivers eventually just disappear into a sink or into the ground somewhere and don't get out. And so it's also the region of the US traversed by the Transcontinental Railroad. And so we were traveling about the 150th anniversary of that connecting. There's a famous event called the Golden Spike, or the nailing of the Golden Spike, that connected the railroad. And it was the first time that you could then get on a train, say in New York City, and get all the way to California on the train. And this is, of course, a major event in American history, especially in terms of colonial history, in terms of the formation of American land empire across the continent, enabling suddenly not just passengers, but the shipping of goods, etc. And so this becomes a kind of linchpin of America's colonization of the land, or the United States' colonization of the land. And so that was the region that we were in, and we spent most of our time there, but we also brought in material from the rest of our travels, and had a kind of, as the title Compendium would suggest, a kind of overview of the Fieldworks project. So another kind of big expansive exhibition. We brought back those tables again to do the kind of tabletop displays, connecting up various things, including some of the student work from the trip that we took together. And on the wall on the left-hand side in the far distance is a large wall text that I authored of a huge range of concepts that I think are instrumental in understanding the material on display. So the hope was that you would go read the top text, understand what's going on, and then pick concepts from that list that you could then use to understand some of the art on display. And we also included, as you can see on the right-hand side, these small numbered tokens, which would connect some of Todd's photographs on the wall to some of the items on display on the table around shared themes. And in addition to that, introduced a kind of third way of making sense of the exhibition with these panels on each table that provided some suggestions for engaging with the exhibition. So you can see there are some objects that have returned here. Our tumbleweed is back. Our volume, the survey volume from, I believe it's the King survey, is back. But there's some new material as well as the archive grows and grows, and as we are able to make different kinds of connections based on what we're gathering together. On the right-hand side is a portion of the exhibition dedicated to student photographs. A lot of the students who came with us were photography students, but even those who weren't made some really stellar photographs. So part of why I want to show this exhibition is to show the kind of collaborative nature of Fieldworks and the adaptability to different groups of people working together on a project. And so this brought together a whole wide range of collaborators, not just from this one trip, but from past trips as well. So I don't know, this is also my plea, if CU Boulder is interested in working together on a Fieldworks trip, we would be excited to explore that possibility as well. one final exhibition, and then I'll show some other kinds of projects to conclude. This is our current exhibition up at a new museum space in Oklahoma City called Oklahoma Contemporary, that's only been open for a couple of years now. Opened amidst the pandemic, which was a bit tricky, but they're a fantastic resource here in our region and are hosting really fantastic contemporary art exhibitions. And so we were really honored and pleased that they invited us to do an exhibition under the title Beyond Measure. And so the idea for this particular show, a bit like the First Things exhibition, was to come up with a theme rather than this broad overview of the whole project in order to organize an exhibition. And so that was one, I'll use the word constraint, but it didn't feel limiting. It was just a way of structuring things. The other was that the gallery that we were presenting in is a challenging space, as you'll see from some of the installation photos, and also a space that the museum uses for a variety of other purposes, which meant that we had to stick exclusively to the walls. So our thought was, how do we get our usual tabletop mess and make it a tidier thing on the gallery wall? And so the strategy that we came up with was to develop a series of installations that clustered together photographs as well as videos from our archive, along with texts that I wrote that have kind of a half narrative, half descriptive function. They're kind of these really dense, kind of challenging, difficult to read texts. There's a German word, Denkbilder, that gets used by people like Walter Benjamin and Theodor Adorno and others to describe their like really kind of short, like pithy, complicated little texts that they would write for various of their projects, like Adorno's Minima Moralia, for instance. And so inspired by that kind of tradition, I developed these texts about the Southwest and about the desert, focused on different kinds of themes where issues of measurement and failures of measurement, or representation and its collapse or its limitations, were all things to consider or to conceive. And so this particular installation deals with the Mexico-US borderland region. And there are photographs that Todd's made of, say, the Rio Grande River, which forms a large portion of that border, obviously, of a Border Patrol museum, where he's one of the photographs of, it gets too complicated if I try to explain everything, but one of the photographs is from that museum. There's shots of the of El Paso and Juarez at night. And then there's this image of a sweatshirt that we found in the desert in Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument, which is a fairly common border crossing zone. And this sweatshirt had been clearly worn by someone who was crossing the border and then taken off and discarded. And it had been, torn apart by thorns and cacti and things like that. And it had the word love written across the chest, which was just really kind of like touching and sort of poignant in a way. And so it's one of the objects in our archive, and we weren't able to present many physical objects, so instead we photographed them. And then my text on the wall tells a couple of different kinds of stories. One about a guy named Esteban, who was a Moor enslaved by the Spanish, who wound up being almost accidentally, or more or less entirely accidentally, I suppose, one of the first people to come from Europe or Africa to the Americas and to explore what's now the southwestern United States. He'd been shipwrecked in Florida, and he and his group, very few of whom survived, walked all the way through Texas and up into New Mexico, and then back down into Mexico, where they finally reconvened with the Spanish in Mexico. And so his story is incredible. And so it starts narrating a bit of that and talking about him as one of the first people to participate in the kind of colonial project in what's now the United States. And then it segues into discussions of a cemetery in Holtville, California, where unidentified migrants who die crossing the border are buried. And it's one of the most harrowing places I've ever been. It really left a deep mark in me. And so I wanted to discuss it in this particular text. And so the idea is you read the text and you think about the deeper histories of the movement of people across various lines that may or may not have existed at various points in time. And you also think about the kind of current situation on the border and how that's being negotiated, mostly misnegotiated in recent years. And so the notion is that the whole installation kind of provides a constellation of different things for you to look at and think about as you come to your own kinds of conclusions about what you're seeing there. And so that format we then used in a couple of other places. in the gallery, or throughout the gallery, really. This one here is focused mostly on the Las Vegas area and thinking about Las Vegas as a center of capital, as a site where pleasure and pain are had in fluctuating measures. So again, a large image kind of organizing things with one of Donald Trump's buildings there, though Trump slightly obscured, I think appropriately so. Don't give him the credit that he doesn't deserve. And then images from the general Las Vegas area that allude to a variety of different events that have taken place there, including the recent mass shooting in Las Vegas a few years ago that was the deadliest in US history. And so two of the smaller images there are gesturing toward that. And the wall text for this tells a really kind of unbelievable but true story about the singer Sammy Davis Jr. And the racism that he faced as a performing artist in Las Vegas. As one of the few Black performers on the Strip back during the Rat Pack days with Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and all of that. And there's a story about his encounters with the mafia that's just, like I said, outrageous and unbelievable, but absolutely true. And so that kind of organizes for you like Vegas as a site of spectacle and pleasure and entertainment, and then also of some of the like gnarlier and seedier aspects of American life and American culture. So these installations kind of populate, excuse me, I went too far, the galleries with various kind of thematic frameworks. The one you're looking at a kind of zigzagged hallway here. The one in the foreground deals with water issues and ways that water gets measured and kind of exceeds measurement in the desert. And then down the hall on the left-hand side, a clustering that has to do with issues of kind of belonging and relationship to place, including issues of poverty and also sort of gender and sexuality. There's a really fantastic novel that was written set in Reno. That's one of the first LGBTQ novels to achieve public success. And of course, now that I'm speaking of it, the title has totally left my mind. I think I have it on my shelf here. Yes, Desert of the Heart by Jane Rule. It's a quite a good novel, and there's a really transformative scene that happens at Pyramid Lake, and that's on the Pyramid Lake Paiute Reservation in northern Nevada. So a place we've been many times. And so kind of bringing all of that clustering about like, you know, who belongs where and what is it to relate to community, et cetera, in that particular clustering of things. And that novel became the subject for, it was adapted into a film called Desert Hearts that's well worth watching as well. So anyhow, the reason I guess I mentioned that is that media content is a thing we're constantly thinking about, and the overrepresentation of the Southwest is a fun theme to play off of and to compare and contrast how, say, John Ford, who's filmed out in the West so many times, how his representations of it relate to others, and how myth and all of that correlates to the landscape in various ways. So anyhow, just flagging that interest. We did have one shelf though where we were able to show some archival objects in this particular exhibition. So here are some of those things, including on the far left-hand side, a piece of the meteorite that was used to date the Earth. And then kind of front and center, there's a can which contains bristlecone pine seeds. So if you've got 5,000 years or so, you can grow your own ancient bristlecone pine tree out of what's inside of that can. And then other items that we found floating around in the desert, as well as one of my fieldwork notebooks. So what I'd like to kind of wrap up with are a few projects that I'll describe more briefly that are more kind of toward publication and screening processes, and kind of just show you some of the other things that I'm thinking about. These maybe are more evidently art historical projects as well in some ways. So for those who are interested in that sort of thing, these may be the things for you. The first is an essay called The Fertilized Crescent, Artistry in the Imperial Valley, which I wrote and which Todd kindly lent me images to illustrate. And this is an essay about the Salton Sea in Southern California and the kind of region around it in the Imperial Valley of California, or Imperial County, California as well. And so you see the Salton Sea at the upper left-hand side there. It's a man-made lake made through what you might call like an accident on purpose or something like that. there had long been a desire to irrigate this part of the desert in order to start farming it. It's an ancient seabed that used to be part of the Gulf of California. And so, as ancient seabeds often are, it has nutrient rich soil. And people realized, hey, if we can get water from the Colorado River over here, then we can start farming and et cetera, et cetera. Otherwise, it's a pretty open and fairly barren patch of desert. Um, it does overlap with the homelands of the Cahuilla people, who also live up in the mountains to the west, and the Kamehameha people who live more to the south, and others. So it's not as if it was actually an empty place per se, but it is very inhospitable land that would be very, very sparsely populated. And now, kind of almost overnight, if you think in the long timelines of human history, civilization is there in full. And so you've got basically in the last 120 years, have gone from an open expanse of desert that maybe people might pass through but wouldn't necessarily be settling in, to a place that supports urban infrastructure and farmland, etc. So I was interested in how artful means like things like water infrastructure or development of real estate, and of agriculture itself, these kinds of practices through which people artfully transform land and make it into something that it wasn't before, have been brought to bear in this particular region in ways that have really radically reshaped it, and have introduced the kind of like hierarchical civilization with states and laws and writing, et cetera, into that particular place in this kind of accelerated way, in the way that like fertilizer accelerates growth. And so fertilizer is central to the story of the Salton Sea. The lake itself is absolutely full of dissolved fertilizer that's runoff from agriculture, and it's quite toxic. And this creates this loopy situation, wherein what you might think of as a thing that should just be left to evaporate and return to its previous state has to be maintained in place. Otherwise, all of this fertilizer that's dissolved in it will become airborne, and it's carcinogenic, and it will cause breathing problems. In fact, it already is to a number of people who live in the region. So this then results in a need to sustain the artificial lake, hence the irrigation and water infrastructure that's continuing to put water back into the lake. And hey, if we're going to be doing that, might as well keep farming. And if we're going to be doing that, might as well keep building up and growing around in the area. So what I'm really interested in here is the way in which all of these kind of artful practices that we pursue, that put a civilization into place, also sustain that civilization, even when it maybe seems unsustainable. And so we have a lot of rhetoric in environmental thinking and ecological thinking around the value of sustainability, for good reason, but we can also sustain things that are deleterious to health and to land and to life. And so I think this is an example here of where something is being sustained that is not actually sustainable, but yet it's being sustained, and it will continue to be so, because in fact it seems as if the unsustainable can persist. And so the Salton Sea is a fascinating place to look at that. 100 years from now, who knows? Maybe I'll take back my argument. But for now, it seems like this is just the way things are going to be there, even though you visit this place and say, this can't possibly, last. And yet it just continues to do so because there's a little bit of money to eke out, or there's a little bit of food to be grown, or something like that, a little bit of resource to extract. And the water rights keep, starting to look precarious, like, oh no, it's not going to last. And then something is worked out so that it continues. And so I'm interested in all of the ways that kind of craftily people have kept this place in action, and written an essay that focuses on all of that. And then at the lower right-hand side, just a nod to a very interesting place, the Slab City Library, which is a kind of anarchist off-the-grid community. Slab City is, and there's a functioning library there, a lending library for the people who find themselves in that particular place. And so I'm interested as well in the kind of countercultural dimensions of this region. You've got this kind of overbearing presence of like agribusiness and development that constantly kind of goes boom and bust as the lake level rises or falls. But there is a kind of countercultural space within there that's part of the larger ecosystem. It doesn't in any sense threaten to dwarf the powers that be, but it's there. And so I'm interested in its kind of larger role in the structure as well. So I jokingly refer, half jokingly refer to the art of library science, as well as the arts of agribusiness and infrastructure, et cetera, as all things that are going on in this particular place. So the librarians at the Slab City Library are kind of sorting and sifting through the material culture of their particular corner of the world. A second project, writing project that is actually part of the exhibition at Oklahoma Contemporary is called The Desert. And this one is, if the Fertilized Crescent essay is about thinking of how art historical methods can be brought to bear on things other than, you know, your conventional fine arts material or even visual culture material. This is one that's maybe more worked out at the level of art historical like methodology or something along those lines, thinking about what it is to describe or to evaluate a particular place or to explain something. And so the text is this massive, I think it's about 20,000 words at this point, long, almost nonsensical, kind of Dadaistic, quasi-poetic text that I've written in my fieldworks notebooks over the years, and sort of pulled out little excerpts here and there and compiled into this larger project, which then was presented in the exhibition as a video. So this is the introductory wall to that exhibition, with the museum's didactic and a photograph of Todd's and our little flat tire. That's an actual flat tire we got on the road once, a huge piece of metal blew out the tire. Anyhow, the larger point here is this text. And so one of the things that I'm constantly doing in these fieldwork notebooks when I'm not jotting down names and dates and facts and those sorts of things is to just do a kind of experimental descriptive writing. And what I do is I let my mind be sort of open to possibility, but also rigorous in terms of perceiving things. And then whatever language is kind of sticking and feels like it needs to be captured, I write down in the notebook. So that will result in wacky syntax. It will result in strange word choice, in odd juxtapositions of things. And I just leave that be, and then let that become a kind of linguistic field to explore later, to pull out possibilities or ideas for research, or just to give directly to an audience as a kind of surreal or like psychedelic read of some of the places that we've been. And in most cases, by the time I go back and revisit these texts, I've forgotten where I generated them. And so they have this really loose and tenuous relationship to place, which is fun, because then that becomes, for me, a way to think back into my own memories, but for others, a way to kind of free associate around the power of language to evoke meaning or significance. And so I thought it was worth presenting them in the exhibition and sharing them with you here. At some point, who knows, maybe I find some obscure experimental poetry press or something that wants to publish this particular text. It's a kind of an impenetrable text, but that's what I like about it. I'm thinking that this text at the top, these two excerpts I've got for you, that one comes from a museum at Sandia Pueblo, north of Albuquerque. At the bottom, your guess is as good as mine, and like what the jazz saxophonist Lee Konitz was doing in my mind at that moment is beyond me at this point, but something suggested something that meant I had to write down Lee Konitz, and so I did. So this is a project that description is probably the fundamental skill that art historians possess. We look at things and we use language in order to describe them and to then undergird any kind of explanation or evaluation or narrative or argument that we want to build around those things. And I thought, what if I get into that space of description and let this landscape and what it's doing, which is not what I'm normally looking at as an art historian, kind of take over and lead me in some other directions. And so, like I said, the result is a little surreal or psychedelic, and it's about kind of saying, let's not do description the usual ways. You know, let's not use the language we would normally use to describe something. Let's get away from, you know, the idea that it has to be a painting that you're looking at, or you know, some aspect of visual culture or something like that, and saying, how would the descriptive act be different? And then what kinds of results could come from that if we challenged it and changed it and did other things with it. And so, you know, here, instead of a description that leads to being a component of an argument about the history of art, you wind up with a, you know, a strange video art project in effect. So how can those skills be repurposed, essentially? A couple more things, and then I'll wind down. This is a project that comes more out of the Inhabiting the Anthropocene group, and also out of some travel I've done in Italy in conjunction with study abroad programs that we lead here at the university. And I've had the good fortune of spending quite a bit of time in southern Italy and Sicily and Campania, both of which are volcanic regions. Vesuvius and Etna are the two major volcanoes there, and there's a lot of other volcanic activity in the region. And I was kind of meditating on that while I was there and thinking about the odd role that volcanoes and volcanism have actually played in the history of art history. And I said, okay, I'm going to write about that. That's something. And so I used the blog, the Inhabiting the Anthropocene blog, as a forum for starting that process and writing a couple of short essays that I've since mediated into a kind of small booklet. And then I'm now kind of currently looking for like what I'm going to do with that, where that's going to go next. But the idea was to kind of look at these instances where Vesuvius and Etna in particular, but volcanism more generally, has been relevant for art history, and to kind of bridge the geology art history divide a little bit, and to think also about instances where like artful human productions or architecture have been useful to the history of geography, or geology, sorry, as well. And so here are some of those blog posts on the blog. And I took them and compiled them along with photographs and field notes into that booklet, and thinking about the ways in which, you know, if you loosen up your kind of disciplinary ties a little bit, you can start to find these fascinating moments of consonance between disciplines. So for instance, Pliny the Elder, the ancient Roman writer, was killed in the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, and he is the author of the oldest surviving art historical texts that we have from antiquity. He cites older Greek writers whose writings are lost, and we only know them through him. So an origin point for art history tied to volcanism in a funny and in fact tragic way. And then Johann Joachim Winkelmann, an important German art historian from the 18th century, participated in the excavations at Herculaneum. And so there's these odd moments where volcanoes and art history come together, and I sort of spin them out a bit metaphorically to think about the notion that in fact actually everything on this planet's surface, with the exception of some meteorites, has volcanic origins of one kind or another, and including our atmosphere, etc. And so, you know, there's this sense in which our processes are the extensions of volcanic processes and connect to our artistic processes in various ways. And so thinking about that larger kind of you know, hybrid natural human sort of way of thinking about process and artistry is what's kind of going on in this particular project. And then one final project that's the most recent and least sort of world tested. I had the good fortune just before the pandemic to travel to South America and to visit the Galapagos Islands and the Andes Mountains. And so I said, okay, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. I don't ever do anything else in that part of the world. I don't think I'm getting back there. I'm going to bring a video camera. I'm going to document this. I'm going to see if I can convince myself to become like a video artist or something in the process. And so I did. I shot a whole lot of video while I was there. And I wrote texts before and after I was there about ways in which movement, the theme of movement, was pertinent to this particular place. I said, hey, I'm going to be a tourist. Let's think about what it means to move. And in fact, everything is moving all of the time, right? All matter is in constant motion. And so this is a concept that kind of unites humans with the ecosystems that they live within. And so it also is relevant for thinking about you know, colonialism in South America as an issue of the movement of people. Also thinking about the Darwinian implications of species evolving and moving through time in various ways. And so I wrote these kind of short paragraph length texts that then become a kind of voiceover track for a video art piece that I've yet to assemble because of the pandemic. But here are some of the images of that, various places that I was or was zooming through at one time or another, looking at Inca stonework, at some of the cities of Latin America, at a tortoise's shell, et cetera, et cetera. And again, that notion of a kind of relational way of connecting things up to one another is kind of key. The idea for this is that it'll be a multi-channel 4-screen presentation with then a single voiceover narrative that's kind of introducing these stories, and that the images will play back at different rates, some of them faster, some of them slower. So some of them are more static and you can kind of get a grip on them over a longer period of time. Other things flash by more fleetingly. And so like this particular cluster of images could in theory happen if the videos line up just right. And you would get, for instance, this large rock outcropping off the coast of the Galapagos, And so I was thinking of stone and connecting that then to this Inca altar that I passed through in one of the Inca sites outside of Cusco. And so thinking about the role of stone as a natural thing, as a thing that humans manipulate, and then thinking about like these kind of permanent lasting things compared to more fleeting things like the newspaper or politics. And so you can build these kinds of connections of meaning out of the images as they associate, and then the text that's playing through can give you other kinds of things to think about and to relate to the images. So my hope in the future is that I become a filmmaker. We'll see if I'm good enough. I'm not sure yet. That's the thing to figure out. And the project that I'm going to be working on moving forward is one that actually connects back to Colorado. So I figured I would gesture toward it here at the end and come full circle. The Animas River in southwestern Colorado that flows down from the Silverton area through Durango toward Farmington, New Mexico, was the site of a massive spill of acid mine drainage about 5 years ago. Something like 3 million gallons of acid mine drainage flowed out of the Gold King mine, which is on Bonita Peak, not too far from Silverton. And I grew up in New Mexico, and I used to go up to the San Juan Mountains in Colorado fairly regularly, and I know this area well. And I was, upset when this particular event took place, and I've been thinking about what I want to say about it for a long time. And so I think this summer, given the restraints of the pandemic, et cetera, I can do things outdoors. I'm going to go and shoot video in the region and make a project out of that. So what you're seeing here are 2 videos released by the Environmental Protection Agency showing the spill itself on the left-hand side and showing some very sort of small scale efforts to remediate it, dumping some lime into the water to change the pH so that the fish don't die. And you can see the color of the drainage is this kind of brownish goldish color. And so that's it flowing out and then through the river on the right hand side. So anyhow, this is going to be like the subject matter for a future project, sort of similar to the previous one, a kind of a video installation piece with multiple channels and a voiceover kind of thing happening. And I'm in the process of writing the script right now. And I'm going to actually this weekend reach out to the Ute and Navajo tribes in the region and ask for their guidance for working on all of this and things like that. So the hope is to go out in June and shoot the video and then pull that together in the back half of the year, and who knows, whenever it's ready, get it out there in the world. So just a kind of like final summary note, I suppose, is to say that the kind of general arc of all of this work is to think about repurposing art history to allow it to focus more directly on ecological and environmental subject matter, not necessarily requiring works of art as like intermediaries in order to say what you want to say, and to think about how artful human practices directly impact upon our environmental surroundings and then impact and influence us as people who have to rely on and live on that land. And so that's maybe a good note to conclude on. And in the absence of a question and answer session, I guess I'll just say thank you very much for your time and attention. And it's been a pleasure and an honor to speak with you, whomever you are, wherever you are out there on the internet. So thanks a lot. And if you do have questions, feel free to contact me. You can find me at my home at the University of Oklahoma. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was fantastic.